Viewer discretion is advised. This video analyzes themes of domestic abuse, manipulation, and exploitation. Some of the scariest things in Courage the Cowardly Dog were never supernatural at all. No curse, no creature, just people, using power over someone weaker than them, in ways that are uncomfortably recognizable. Control disguised as affection, obsession disguised as attention, kidnapping disguised as hospitality, greed disguised as friendship. These are threats that don't need a monster design because the show is describing something that actually happens to actual people. This is a deep dive into that fear, the fear of abuse and cruelty, and how Courage the Cowardly Dog used it to smuggle real, difficult subject matter into a children's cartoon, almost never announcing what it was actually doing. Before getting into the episodes, it's worth being clear about what separates this fear from the show's other recurring horrors. This isn't fear of something incomprehensible, like a curse or an alien. It isn't fear of facing a threat alone, or fear of losing someone. This is the fear of being deliberately harmed, controlled, or used by someone who holds power over you. That takes a few distinct shapes across the series. Sometimes it's domestic control, where affection is used as a leash rather than a comfort. Sometimes it's psychological intimidation, where obsession replaces normal social boundaries entirely. Sometimes it's outright exploitation, being lured, trapped, or used for someone else's benefit under the pretense of kindness. And sometimes it's manipulation driven by greed, where a relationship is treated as a resource to be extracted rather than a bond to be honored. What ties all of it together is that these threats wear a human face, and often a friendly one, at least at first. The scariest part isn't the cruelty itself, it's how ordinary the cruelty is allowed to look before it's recognized for what it is. Let's start with the episode that confronts this fear most directly. The Mask. This episode deals with domestic abuse and control, a dynamic where one figure holds power over another and uses affection, guilt, or fear to keep that power intact. What makes this such a difficult, effective piece of storytelling is that the show doesn't frame the abuse as an obvious monster the way it frames a curse or a magician. It frames it as something quieter, something that can look, from the outside, like an ordinary relationship, right up until you look closely enough to see the control underneath it. That's the core of this particular fear. Abuse rarely announces itself as abuse. It's disguised, sometimes as love, sometimes as protection, sometimes as simple familiarity. And that disguise is exactly what makes it so hard for the person experiencing it to name, let alone escape. This is arguably the most restrained horror the show ever attempts, because there's no visual monster to point to. The threat is behavioral. It's about what one person does to another over time, using power instead of teeth. And the show trusts its audience enough to let that register without needing a creature design to make the point land. Now shift from control inside a close relationship to something that starts outside one and pushes its way in. Freaky Fred. Fred's episode centers on psychological intimidation and obsession, a character whose fixation crosses well past ordinary attention into something that overrides other people's comfort and boundaries entirely. What makes Fred such an effective source of dread isn't loud aggression. It's the mismatch between how calm and cheerful he seems and how unsettling his actual behavior is. He isn't coded as an obvious villain. He's coded as pleasant, even likable, right up until his fixation makes clear that he isn't actually listening to anyone else's discomfort at all. The horror in this episode isn't a jump scare. It's the slow building realization that someone's interest in you has stopped being about you at all. and started being about something they've decided you represent. This episode pushes the fear in a more literal, physical direction. Kidnapping and exploitation, dressed up as warmth and hospitality. Cajun Granny Stew. The premise plays on a very old fear, the danger of trusting an inviting, welcoming stranger, only to discover that the welcome was never sincere. It was bait. That's a particularly cruel version of this fear category, because it weaponizes the very instinct that's supposed to keep people safe. Trusting kindness when it's offered. Exploitation in this episode isn't about raw force. It's about a relationship built entirely on deception, where affection, generosity, or care are performed specifically to lower someone's guard long enough to use them. This is fear of abuse and cruelty in one of its oldest forms. Being lured in by warmth that was never real, and realizing too late that hospitality can be a costume worn by exploitation. Finally, there's a version of this fear rooted less in physical danger and more in emotional and material exploitation, greed and manipulation. A Beaver's Tale. This episode is about a relationship being treated as a means to an end, where one party isn't valued as a person at all, but as something useful to extract value from. That's a subtler cruelty than kidnapping or overt intimidation. But it's no less corrosive. It's the fear of discovering that someone's kindness toward you was never really about you. Manipulation driven by greed works by keeping that reality hidden for as long as possible. It requires the person being manipulated to believe, at least for a while, that the relationship is mutual. The horror in this episode isn't a monster reveal. It's the slow unmasking of a transaction that had been disguised as a friendship the entire time. Not every cruelty needs violence to do damage. Step back for a second and consider why this category lands so differently than the show's other fears. A curse can be broken. A monster can eventually be outrun or outsmarted. Isolation can be resolved when someone finally shows up. But abuse and cruelty are different, because part of what makes them so damaging is how long they can go unrecognized, disguised as love, as friendliness, as hospitality, as friendship, before anyone, including the person experiencing it, is able to name what's actually happening. That's what makes these 4 episodes some of the most quietly demanding material Courage the Cowardly Dog ever produced. There's no creature design to marvel at, no magic trick to be impressed by, just the uncomfortable recognition that cruelty rarely introduces itself honestly. It usually needs a mask first. Affection, charm, hospitality, friendship. And the fear isn't just what happens once the mask comes off. It's how long it can stay on before anyone thinks to look underneath it. Across these 4 episodes, the control disguised as love in The Mask, the obsession disguised as friendliness in Freaky Fred, the exploitation disguised as hospitality in Cajun Granny Stew, and the greed disguised as friendship in A Beaver's Tale. Courage the Cowardly Dog keeps returning to a fear that has nothing to do with the unknown and everything to do with people. None of these threats needed a curse to be frightening. They only needed someone willing to use power, charm, or kindness as a disguise, and a small, frightened dog who kept noticing what everyone else around him was willing to overlook. That noticing, more than any fight or escape, might be the bravest thing Courage does in the entire series.